Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Michael Steele Podcast. I'm Michael Steele. It is always a joy when you come into the neighborhood and spend some time with us and do the things that you love to do to make me feel yummy inside, like that download thing and the, 5 stars, all that. Yeah, we love it when you do that. But I love it even more when you spend some time with us. And we're excited about the conversation we're going to have today because I get to watch the sister. She's on another network. But I get to watch her from time to time over there in the land of CNN. She is Laura Coates, a CNN senior legal analyst, Sirius XM host, and author of the book that we're going to get into, Just Pursuit: A Black Prosecutor's Fight for Fairness, which actually is just hitting the streets. And by the time this podcast really gets going, it would, I guess, because your official launch date is like the 18th, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is really nice to be able to talk to you right as it's coming out fresh. Just so you guys get a little bit of her background and what makes her such a really good legal analyst, because she was a damn good U.S. attorney. She was served as a U.S. Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, which is, that real high-end stuff, and a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, specializing in the enforcement of voting rights throughout the United States. She is a graduate of Princeton University, their School of Public and International Affairs, and the University of Minnesota Law School. And it is a real treat to welcome you, Ms. Coates, to the house.
I'm so glad I'm here. I gotta tell you, I wonder, I'm gonna use that phrase about feeling yummy inside. That was I love it. I'm so glad.
Well, as we were talking a little bit, folks, before we turned all the equipment on, and I was telling her in reading through the book, I love the way you tell the stories. A lot of times when people, particularly professionals in the legal space, and I'm a recovering lawyer. I was on corporate side, so we made the money. But although you kept us out of jail, so we know how, it was a balance here. It's a balance.
Well, I didn't know how to put it, but okay. That's good. That's
Look,
good.
I learned early on in my legal career. Now, when you walk past the litigator's office, you just nod, just acknowledge the presence. But you tell the stories so well in the book, and we'll get into a couple of them. But I want to start, I guess, more broadly and sort of narrow in. What was it that you saw that needed to be told right now? Particularly given all of the narratives that we see out on the street, the big trials that are being concluded and that are underway, that touch on race, that touching even on financial transactions, that in some sense is riveting, but in other sense is a little bit concerning, because there is this feeling among a lot of Americans, they don't know whether or not the criminal justice system is really going to do justice. And you opened up in the introduction, and this is why I put it this way, you open the conversation up with your reader right out of the gate. Quote, "The pursuit of justice creates injustice." Mm. And I was like, okay, strap in. She's about to go there. What is it that you saw that would make you say that, write that? And how does that feed the narrative of your book?
So I think the thought, when people think about what kind of book would someone like me write, I think the expectation was something of a legal textbook, right? A law school discussion on, here's a Supreme Court case, and then let's unpack it and deconstruct it in real time and draw examples and analogies and distinguish them. But for me, I really wanted to tell the stories, not from this esoteric inaccessible lens. I wanted to tell the stories of people who are most impacted by the justice system. I made it intentionally narrative. I reflected as a memoir. Every chapter is episodic and can stand alone,
Right.
but they also personify issues, Michael, that we're talking about in real time today. And I really was drawn to the practice of law through the storytelling component. The idea of the civil rights movement, the idea of championing causes, the idea of being able to use one's voice and talents to be able to advocate and help people. But I also saw very early on in my career, from going from the civil rights division, where frankly, if you show up to town as a civil rights attorney, no one's questioning whose side you're on. Your
Right.
moral compass is pretty much due north. Then you go to a criminal prosecution side, and you are often perceived as a traitor, as one who it's questioning about your battle of allegiance. Whose side are you on? And it was jarring for me to have those sort of revelatory moments and how I was perceived, even if my approach to justice had not changed. And so I wanted to speak to this notion at a time where we have right now, where people are so tuned in to the calls for justice reform, the idea of speaking truth to power. I felt compelled to help in the sense of, if you want to speak truth to power, you first ought to know what the truth is. And you have to be careful about what you're asking for, because that justice is not a destination, and that it oftentimes is the result of this ecosystem of all these different factors and people in the periphery, not just the people whose names are the other end of that United States' verses.
Right.
And so I wanted to make sure we broadened and also better understood what justice looked like, what it felt like, and hoping that people could use this, which was partially a catharsis for me to talk about the experiences, as a catalyst for understanding what reform might look like or why.
Yeah. I mean, and you walk through a number of stories that give you a sense of that. But I want to figure out, before you really even get into that, how do you, as a prosecutor, define truth when victims, defendants, and the public may be defining it differently? Or, certainly if you're a defendant, your sense of truth, it may be a slightly different sometimes, because you're trying to save your behind. But how do you begin to as a prosecutor, get the public to focus on what that truth is? Because I think that's an important part. I mean, and I think that's one of the things that was really concerning when you look at the Ahmaud Arbery case, when you look at the George Floyd case, whether or not the truth would actually be the thing that prevailed. And so everybody had to have an understanding of what the truth is, because we had too many examples in the past where, even looking at the video, which ultimately, ostensibly, Laura, should speak to the truth of what we're seeing, people would be like, well, I don't know if that's exactly accurate. And we saw a little bit of that, in a number of cases where they were saying, well, what was the quality of the video, and how many pixels? And it's like, dude, I see the guy running away and the cops shoot him in the back. I don't need pixels to tell me that is truth. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, I always find it interesting and unsettling that truth is so often a Rorschach test. And that people are approaching truth, obviously bringing their own biases. Their lens and perspective is clouded by their own experiences, and also by their stereotypes and implicit and explicit bias. All these things factor in and inform how you are going to view even objective information. And I think that the truth can often be inconvenient for people, but I'll answer in two ways, because we all have different sort of performative aspects of roles. As a prosecutor, the truth was the presentation of the evidence that could be corroborated by people, firsthand witnesses, by the testimony, by evidence, the developing of the story as here is what unfolded, and leading the jury, that is the horse, to water and hoping they will drink. based on obviously your ethics, based on what truly is there. And they have to be that fact finder. People often forget about that notion. In our pursuit of a verdict, there are fact finders who you present to, and their job is to decide whether I think the people who are your vehicles of information are credible enough. And so in the courtroom, truth is in many respects what the jury believes it to be. But the prosecutor has a great deal of power in shaping that. And we have the weight of the federal government. And how often you've heard people say, well, they wouldn't have brought a case against this person had they not done something. And we get a benefit of the doubt as prosecutors that often officers do as well. They wouldn't have stopped you had you done something wrong. And so you have to really be careful about how that particular truth is assigned to you and uphold it, whether you are basing it off of actual credible evidence, or whether you're just taking advantage and getting the windfall of benefit of the doubt. You're talking about how in the court of public opinion it's perceived. You mentioned the videotape of the killing of George Floyd, or the shooting of Walter Scott, or what we saw from the video of the killing and the pursuit of Ahmaud Arbery. But for people being able to see with their own eyes, people are believing that whatever information's coming is filtered by biased and people with an angle and an axe to grind. And so you see it in politics. I know you know this well, that people in their individual echo chambers and their silos of information, they will only view what is truthful based on whether they believe the actual messenger. And even if that messenger, time and time again, is a liar, has proven to be so, they become so entrenched. Videos change that. And it acts in many ways, Michael, the way I look at it as until, sort of the Billie Holiday, seeing the proverbial strange fruit, not knowing before you actually see the hoses on people in the civil rights era, the freedom riders then going down to look, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the viewing of an open casket of Emmett Till, the video footage of George Floyd's murder. This forced people to be able to see it through their own lens and be able to experience it vicariously. And that is what I tried to do in the book, of allowing people to come on the journey, to walk beside, to see what you would have done, to see what your truth would have been.
That is fascinating way to begin that walk, because a lot of that also deals with the fact that people, even when they may get this information or this truth from a third party, so that reinforces or reaffirms their own conclusion before they know any facts, right? And we've seen that many times. A lot of times people don't need that, though. That they've already made up their mind. And I'm going to put a pin in that point, because you tell the story of the judge who made up her mind about the rape victim as she walked into the courtroom. And so that by the time you get to that point in the book, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, of course she did. You just sort of find yourself coming along and beginning to understand a little bit more clearly what all these little elements that go into our criminal justice system, how they all kind of mesh up and connect. And one of those important elements start with the men and women who do the prosecution. You are a Black woman, a mom, who has a stellar legal, professional, academic background. And yet you start us out in the second chapter. I mean, it's just like, hey, you want to see something funny? Folks, this is the title of the chapter. Want to see something funny? On being trained by a white male colleague how to interrogate a Black defendant. And is the structure of that conversation about how you coming into the system are trained to be conformed, or is it something else? In other words, are there racial components, male, female components, or is it just, hey, this is how we interrogate defendants, and this is how you need to do that? how did you see the system shaping your legal career and how you would do your job as a prosecutor?
I think it's all of those different facets that inform your approach to prosecution. I mean, I didn't have the luxury, nor do I think I ever wanted to leave who I was and my different aspects of my identity at the door. Much like you and I both do television and commentary, the pun is a talking head, but if you're a talking head, you've only become robotic. You have to bring the talking human being and all facets of your identity into that, whether it's your politics in your case or the ideas of your personal identity, all of it comes into play. And so this chapter explores a time when one of my colleagues who was more senior to me was hoping to train me and believed that something about me, by virtue of being a prosecutor, that I would find a kindred spirit and camaraderie in his approach to justice and his approach to trying to terrify and manipulate a caged young Black man in the basement of our offices. And I call him caged, but he was actually chained to the chair within a confined space, not an actual cage, obviously. But the idea of what was it, I explore, what was it in that moment that you would have believed I would have wanted to emulate? Sort of this expectation that his approach to flexing and beating his own chest and the bravado and the power trip, that was the very kinds of things that people believed prosecutors acted like and sort of derived pleasure from. And by virtue of me being now with this title, the assumption was I sought that same validation. I sought that same, persona, and that I would relish in the power. And so I approach it in the idea of not only the mansplaining aspect of it, or the impact of race and the differences of who we were, but at the core, the distinctions of me realizing the assumptions and perceptions that people were making by virtue of my membership in this sort of fraternity of sorts of being a prosecutor. And the elements of mistrust, the elements of expectation, what it meant to pursue justice were all challenged in a moment like that, not just because of race or gender differences, but just the thought of why would you think I would emulate this and have others emulated? And were you taught this same behavior? And what domino effect that would have in the greater scheme of things?
Yeah, there is the moment when you meet this defendant and he offers you his chair.
Yes.
I love the way you set that. You probably didn't really intended the way at least I read it, but it just struck me. It was this huge contrast between this young Black man and your partner that you were working with, and how that interaction between you and this defendant seemed to catch him off guard. Your colleague off guard. What did you think that was all about? I mean, that here's this young, it's like, offering you a chair, to the point where it then, he was like, well, maybe I'll get her a chair and she can sit down, how did all of that how does all of that feed into these relationships within our criminal justice system?
It was, I included that and described what was happening because it was a huge distinction in an approach to humanity. It was the idea of recognizing this young man, even although he was chained to a chair and in this compromising position in the power dynamic, was still extending and recognizing another human being, and in my case, obviously a woman, who was standing, and he wanted to think about the comfort of somebody else and hoped, I think in some respects, it would be a conversation, or his home training, as we say, still required that. Whereas my colleague, brash and unaffected, or even not even realizing that moment and the approach. But I think it just speaks to what we often forget, and that we caricaturize defendants and we assume and which is something that's very false. We assume monsters where human beings actually are. And in the years I prosecuted and all the cases I saw, I could probably count on one hand the number of quote unquote monsters that I met. What I really met were people who had made choices, and sometimes choices made for them over the course of their lives that put them where they are today. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have responsibility or have accountability. I'm a prosecutor. I wasn't somebody who was like, oh, well, let's just sing Kumbaya. I believe in redemption, but I also believe in accountability. And after that, in redemption later on. But I tell you that we oftentimes caricaturize and just think about whoever is on the other side of that V, whether it be an individual defendant or an arrestee. We take away the human element of it. And we forget that not only how we should as human beings view each other, but how a judge in sentencing, how a jury in looking at the person are going to view. So as much as it's incumbent upon us for altruistic reasons and for our own humanity to think about people, it also is something that has to be contemplated for successful prosecution and successful defense. I mean, defense counsel, the first thing they do is humanize the person, right? They want to refer to that person as only their name in a courtroom. You know, where I would say the defendant, the defense counsel is going to say the person's name. You're going to talk about, you know, the characteristics about this person that makes them, you know, just like you in a voir dire or in the course of the narrative and the trial. And I think we do a disservice for humanity reasons when we ignore it, but also as prosecutors and strategists, if you ignore the reality that there is a hope that this person's experience, qualities, or characteristics will either resonate with the jury or doom them in the end.
How then do you put together, or how do you hold together that side of your brain that is very much tapped into the job of a prosecutor, the law, the rule of law, the defendant in front of you, the case and all of that. And then that other side that is the mom, the Black female, the mother, the civil servant, the activist. I mean, you know, how do you find yourself sometime in conflict? When you're standing there in that moment going, okay, which one's gonna call the shots here?
Absolutely. I mean, the book very much so in the different chapters talks about those battles of allegiance, Michael. You know, the idea of how sometimes unexpectedly different facets of yourself are competing, right? You've got what your lived experience is versus the idea of wanting to extend the benefit of the doubt to officers who are critical to your cases, helpful and necessary members of law enforcement who, in my experience as a prosecutor, I needed to and could rely on the officers. But then you have the lived experiences and you have your own personal, thoughts, and you have those viewpoints, and you think about how they're going to come in conflict. And then ultimately, you know, you're not just debating this and pontificating, you're doing it in real time, juggling and balancing these aspects of yourself. But you've chosen to be a federal prosecutor.
Right.
So ultimately, you must resolve in favor of what you are supposed to be doing as a prosecutor. But that's a very difficult journey. But then you think to yourself, well, what does that mean to resolve it? Does that mean that, you know, no matter what, you put your blinders on, you sort of shed yourself? For me, no. For me, it meant that when I stood up to say that I am Laura Coates on behalf of the United States of America, that included the person who was the defendant. That had to include the person for whom I was, prosecuting a charge about. I mean, they weren't our individual clients. It wasn't like it was the survivor or the victim's name. They weren't a personal client like they were at a law firm. When I worked at law firms, they're not my client. The people of the United States are my clients. That's who you're advocating for, to prevent them from experiencing what the other person just did, and to have even victimless crimes, that it's an affront to society, certain aspects, whether it's drug-related cases, let alone homicide, and of course, voting cases, et cetera. So I had to think about it in the sense of, because we represent not the person of the United States or the facet, it's the people. You have to bring all those in. You have to think about what others are bringing in, what that represents, and that tapestry. And it's very difficult to do.
Right.
And I challenge myself even now when I'm as a legal analyst, I provide information. I never try to offer my opinion under the guise of facts. When I have an opinion, I say what it is. When it's about presenting the evidence and presenting the facts and presenting it to you in a way that you can create and you can decide your own informed opinion, that's also a role and what I have to straddle. And I think we as a society compartmentalize out of necessity. I know I oftentimes struggled with what would trump, what would be the guiding light, and how would I approach this? And sometimes there's a myth that a prosecutor is just out for blood. I know I was not. And sometimes it would be the case where I would talk to the jury about, and from the perspective of and all the time, my whole self, but that was learned. That was a learned behavior.
So that begs the question for me: that what happens when a prosecutor has a moral objection to the law that they have to enforce, or find themselves in some type of, during the course of a trial, some type of moral conflict, either with the law or with the facts, or how do you work through that and still maintain the dignity of the role and responsibility you have representing the United States and all of that in that case?
You talk to your colleagues, you confront the frustration, you don't hide it in the sense of pretend it doesn't exist, because as I said, it could be a liability in your case. If you're thinking this, maybe your jury has questions about something as well. So it's not as if, it's kind of like that old saying when you're in school and they say there's no such thing as a dumb question, even though sometimes there are dumb questions. There's thing is a dumb question because the question that you don't want to ask, somebody else obviously has, right?
Right.
You can kind of have that approach in the sense of your moral dilemmas are not novel, right? In some respects, the questions that you have raised about what might be difficult for you have likely been difficult for somebody else. So you do seek out, and I sought out advice, and I sought out sometimes a sounding board, other times directives, other times the exit ramps that would allow it to be somebody else, or and other times just staying the course. So you have to confront and realize this is a factor and this is a fact of life. But I also think that really we have to, when you think about justice, I mean, that's what you're working for, the Department of Justice. And justice requires a holistic approach and a holistic perspective of things. It's really never black and white. I mean, on those cases that, look, somebody walks in, here's your fingerprint, it wasn't me. Here's the video, it wasn't me. Here's the person telling us. Remember the Austin Powers movie and the whole thing about that ate my bag, baby? The book by Austin Powers. This is my bag, baby.
Right.
Sometimes it is that clear, Michael. And you're like, there's no dilemmas there, right?
Right.
I get it. And then there's the moments when you're like, there is the nuance. So how do you approach it? And what about this moment that you are in, that you are the one prosecuting this case? What can you bring from yourself to help and serve? And what can you bring from yourself to protect the constitutional rights that even that defendant also has? And you do it out of a sense of duty. You do it out of a sense of obligation. The law does require you to exercise that sort of vigilance over the rights of the defendants by providing exculpatory evidence. You can't just say win at all costs and the ends justify the means. And so, I think that's really how I seek counsel. I seek, a reflect, but ultimately that's one of the reasons I left the Department of Justice, because for me, the cost benefit analysis and the conundrums and the battles of allegiance was something that I wanted to share and infuse the conversations with, because that's really where the next horizon is.
We are having a great conversation with CNN legal analyst and author of Just Pursuit, a Black Prosecutor's Fight for Fairness, Laura Coates. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with more with Laura right after this. Welcome back, everybody. We are having a really good conversation with Laura Coates. She is the author.
Why do you sound surprised? Hold on, Michael. Why do you sound surprised by that?
No. Okay, Madam Prosecutor. I'm not, no, I just, no, sometimes I'm not surprised, but, sometimes you don't know how conversations go because this is heavy stuff. It's, it's legal, it's law, and it's justice system. And you talk about it with such fluidity and ease, and it's not one where I have to go get my Black's Law Dictionary and start explaining to the audience what they just heard.
Yeah,
so that's the book, folks. That's what I think you're going to walk away from the read feeling. You kind of gone through this journey with this woman and her career and the choices she had to make and the things that she's observed. And you have a little bit better understanding of how all of these little pieces kind of come together. So forgive me if I sound surprised. I'm really not surprised. And like I said, I've watched your analysis on CNN, and what you said before we went to break is very much what you do. You are very much, here are the facts. This is not my opinion. This is what the law is. These are the facts in the matter that we're discussing. And this is how, the judge could interpret it, the jury may see it, et cetera, et cetera. So you walk people through it. And I think that's good because a lot of times in this environment where the big lie is the prevailing narrative, that a significant portion of our population is tending to buy into, it is refreshing to have someone just kind of put it out there on the street the way it is. And there's no agenda, there's no bias. This is what it is. So that's what my tone was about.
Just giving you a hard time.
I know, but no, and it really, you've done a very good job with the storytelling portion, because a lot of times, as we discussed at the very beginning, these types of narratives and stories can be rather matter of fact and rather pedantic and all of that, and you kind of lose the person in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that there were a number of them, but the one that stood out to me, I think it's in the 10th chapter, where you talk about the judge, and the woman the young woman who is accusing her father, a man who's not a biological father, but someone who's played that male role in her household with her mom, go through this trial and how the judge viewed her.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us about that, because it really was an interesting way you were almost as if you were a third-party observer in that chapter, where I couldn't tell if you were shocked and you kind of caught yourself sort of observing these things outside of the typical bounds or norms in which you would as a prosecutor, or what. So walk us through this story and how that shaped your view of the system.
Well, it's that chapter. It's called "No One Who Has Been Raped Would Ever," and it was sort of a phrase of that I remember growing up and hearing about the accusations and victim blaming and what a woman would wear and how she would act, even more generally, who is entitled to be thought of as a victim in general, across the board, whether it's sexual assault or otherwise. And sort of the expectations that people have of who's entitled to be a victim and what you would act like and when you would report it and what you would say and how you would feel and sort of the dramatics you think that are happening. Then you really actually see what in reality it looks like, what people's choices are, how they respond, that victimization has many different approaches and faces of victims and survivors. And one of the reasons you choose for especially delayed reporting cases, which we hear a lot about in the news,
Right.
Bill Cosby case would be a prime example of delayed reporting. The Harvey Weinstein Me Too discussions about the reasons for delayed reporting. You've seen the sort of the spectrum of people's reactions to it, or oh, when did that really happen, and the skepticism and the judgment. And so realizing that, prosecutors oftentimes have the opportunity for delayed reporting cases to sometimes approach to just a bench trial, which you mean where it's not a jury, it's going to be a judge deciding the case. And you do it because you expect judges to sort of silence all that judgment and silence all the preconceived notions and just approach the case from what the facts actually demonstrate.
Right.
And this chapter, and of course, we have this stereotype that a woman would have an automatic level of sympathy and empathy for another woman's experience. And this chapter talks about what it was like watching a woman, a judge, on a bench trial, acting precisely how you would expect the worst of the jurors to behave.
Right.
And that robe somehow did not, should not have made you assume that they were totally not just on the up and up. It's not what I mean, as if she was somehow complicit, but a criminal. I don't mean that. I mean that did not guarantee impartiality. And so even at the level of a judge, where we assume that robe is going to, prevent and block the bias that we all bring in, it did not happen. And the experience of watching this young girl experience and be destroyed by that, what that felt like watching, was as much a part of the story of, in an era we say, believe women, and we champion that, and people shout it from the mountaintops, and it's a sword and a shield, and everyone is supposedly on board with this notion. Again, who we are as a society on paper and Twitter versus what it looks like in real life in a courtroom.
So were there episodes like that, and just how you saw the system, the criminal justice system itself operating, functioning, how, defendants were pushed through it. Did that begin to feed or lead into the thinking, the reasonings and thoughts you had around the criminal justice itself, where you would begin to question this system as a system?
Yes.
What was that like, and what has that been like?
I still question, and I still wonder and reflect on that time in my life. And also, there was always this dilemma I felt too, because it was, are you more useful as an agent of the system or a spectator of the system? And, I know you yourself have probably wrestled with the idea of, am I more impactful as an incumbent or somebody who is commenting on it and using your experience and insight?
Just went through that.
I mean, it's this dilemma, and we probably have it in other aspects of our lives. I mean, not just what you and I are doing specifically professionally. And so I wrestled with that, Michael. I wrestled with the idea of, am I sort of throwing in the towel and saying, you know what, this is too hard, it's difficult, so I'm not going to do it, and choosing the path of least resistance and perceived luxury. And is that selfish of me to do, to acknowledge the dilemmas, acknowledge the complications, but just take it on the chin and keep going? And that was something that I grappled with. For me, it was better. For me, it was more impactful in my mind, and I hope in my practice, to use the experiences that I had to now inform how people can view and hopefully change and shape the justice system. But also recognizing that, we talk about justice, but it's a system. I mean, it's not just one case. It's never going to be one verdict any more than our democracy is contingent on one legislative action. It's part of an entire system. And I think that people have to, in their own private moments, in those wee small hours of the moment, in the morning, decide whether your utility is better served within or without.
Did or does being a mom play into that as well, particularly when you see young people trapped in this system? How do you find yourselves? I remember as Lieutenant Governor going to visit Eager Street Academy in Baltimore City, and that's where they housed 13 to 18-year-old boys and girls, and walking in there and looking into the eyes and the faces of these young men, and having two sons who at that time when I was in office were 14 and 9, 14 and 11, and I'm just sitting there. I'm just overwhelmed by the moment, because it was almost, and I could really identify what Barack Obama had said about Trayvon Martin, in that sense that, that could have been me. And certainly as a father with two boys, that could be my boys, and how would I feel? And it really put an urgency behind the work that I did in the criminal justice space. In fact, it turned out, I found out later that I was really the first elected official to ever not just visit, but to come back. And every year I would go back and visit the young men and women, 2, sometimes 3 times a year. Got into a big battle with our GSA, General Services Administration, because I wanted to get used computers because they had high school set up into the, oh, well, you can't do that. Well, why can't I? You're going to throw the computers away. Why don't we let these kids have it? So that dad thing took over, and how I began to look at the system. And then the lieutenant governor piece was there because I knew, at least in the office I held, I could do something, or at least attempt to do something about it. You're in that similar situation where, you're a prosecutor, but you're a mom. You're a prosecutor, but you are a citizen. And so you've already touched on a little bit of some of that conflict, but beyond the conflict, was it something that you felt made it a little bit easier, or the passion felt different? How did being the mom side of Laura Coates play into the prosecutor side of Laura Coates?
I'm so glad that you shared that story, because one, it helps, I think, everyone to get to know your heart even more, number one. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so powerful because we have to stop. I mean, even though it's useful to compartmentalize, you didn't check yourself at the door. You brought yourself into the room, and yes. Into the room. You didn't just take a seat, you right. Had a seat there and who you were. And I think that's important. And for me, I wrote the book, and some of these stories talk about the idea of, I was pregnant at times. I had my babies back to back, they're only about 18 months apart. And so I had my little stair step babies. And, but I remember thinking about it, and I wrote it from the idea of, I wanted my children to know what I was carrying while I was carrying them.
Wow.
And I wanted them to understand that. And I think that as a mother, it changed really the way I approached cases. And I think like so many people who have it drilled into their head that you're supposed to pretend that, you're not pregnant until you're like getting ready to give birth, and right. It might make you look weak, et cetera. If you're emotional in some way. I think for me, when I became a mother, it shattered constraints for me. I saw humanity from a very different lens. I thought about, this could be my child, whether it was the person who was victimized right. Or the person who was the defendant. And in doing so and shaping it, I had to look at it from, it elevated my level of humanity. And I wasn't somebody who, was a Scrooge before and thought,
right.
But until you experience that moment of, how it shatters it, how it changes everything. My father once said to me, I remember when I told him I was pregnant with my first child, he was so excited and overwhelmed and happy. And he said, you know what, Laura, being a mother will be like, be prepared, because being a mother, from here out, you will have your heart live outside of your body. Just, you'll never know what that means until it happens. And I know what it's like to have my heart live outside of my body, but it also is able to see things without my own constraints, without the things that I'm shielding it from. And it allows me to think about things in a very different way. And so it helped, I thought, being a better prosecutor, ironically, but it also at times made me have to take that pause and just think to myself, the approach. And sometimes I had to steel myself to have the resolve to walk in and, be savage when I needed to be, but gentle when I could. And that didn't mean that people weren't convicted in my courtroom. It didn't mean that.
That's still the bottom line.
I know the bottom line was we got the verdicts that the evidence required. However, it did, I'll never forget those moments of sometimes having to, kind of take a breath and think. I write in a chapter about what it was like for me to cross-examine the mother of one of my defendants, who she thought she was going to be helpful, and knowing that she harmed the case, and what that was like, woman to woman, mother to mother, and the approach of it. It carries and stays with me to this day.
I feel for you, baby, but you're guilty. Okay, you're guilty. So as we wrap up, big picture, you wrote, I thought, a very, very strong piece in for CNN entitled "The Bigger Lie Threatening U.S. Democracy." And so your book gives us a snapshot at various times in your career, in your life, and how you look at the system. And how the system sometimes fails and sometimes succeed in its mission. When you step back and you look at the broader idea of democracy and our criminal justice system within that democracy, what's your takeaway? And how does the attack of the big lie undermine aspects of our freedom, whether it's the Shelby decision, the composition of our court system, how we navigate through our voting processes? How are you seeing that now, having written this book, and sort of now you've kind of not bookend, but really kind of can see the whole chapter of things?
It's interesting because the big lie really is, as we know, is all about questioning the integrity of our elections, things that we believe are fair and free and actually are in our elections, right? But also it's about the deeper issue and the more universal one of distrust for our systems. The idea, people think about and they compartmentalize and think, okay, it's one thing for law enforcement to not have trust of the communities that they are policing and assisting. And we sort of put that away and say, reform requires us to think about this in the lens of fortifying, restoring, or maybe even creating trust for the first time. And so it's always odd to me and infuriating that we could recognize the need to instill or reinforce trust, because we know that lives are literally at risk if we don't, but that we don't have that same philosophy, and we instead infuse distrust into the very core of our democracy. I mean, if you know that trust is critical and essential to the functioning of a society that wants to be safe, then why would you not think that trust is critical to a system that relies on the fact that when you go in the voting booth and they hand you that little, round sticker that you put on your, your little collar or your phone, and you do a little cute selfie, like, I voted, whatever you want to do, you are actually saying, I voted and I think it's going to count. Right. I think I voted and then did something, and that's going to mean something. I don't know why people would want to discourage, disincentivize, or make people less trustful of the very core of our democracy. And so, and I think about oftentimes as well, you've got this idea in parallel worlds where you've got, in the cop world, it's deciding and talking about cases like the trial of Derek Chauvin, or the trial of Kim Potter, the ideas of whether an excessive use of force has been used, right? Was it proportional? Did it actually match the level of force used against you? We know that, we talk about that. And then in the voting system, when it comes time to think about, well, you've legislated different things. Is it proportional? Is it actually reactive? Does it make sense or any way? I mean, we know there should be guardrails, but are you following those, or are you getting pretextual reasons that follows a similar script? And so I think people should see these parallels. I wish I'd written a chapter about that. I kind of did, but the parallels of the two things, and thinking about what we can learn from pursuits of justice in one realm are transferable to the next.
Pursuits of justice in one realm are transferable to the next. And she's quotable too. She's Laura Coates, folks. She's the author of the new book, Just Pursuit: A Black Prosecutor's Fight for Fairness. It is out. You will find it on all the platforms that sell good books like this. Amazon, I'm sure, will be one. But please check it out. It is, I think, at these times, a really good read and insights from not just a prosecutor, but a mom, a citizen who actually is sharing a different perspective on how to look at this system as a whole. And I think you'll really, really enjoy it. And I'm just really delighted you take a time or two to spend here in my little shop, my little corner of the world.
Are you yummy inside now?
I'm yummy inside. I'm all yummy inside. We got a little CNN, MSNBC hookup going on. It's all good. It's all good. So, but thank you so much, Laura, for coming by and sharing a word or two. You can follow Laura and track her efforts at CNN and in her writings on Twitter at the Laura Coates. Or the Laura Coates, and certainly check her out on CNN because there's a lot of analyzing to be done for sure, particularly the legal space. But thanks again.
Thank you. Nice talking to you. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. And all the best with the book. Well, folks, that does it for this time together. I love it when you do that download thing. Again, it makes me feel all yummy inside. I love it when you do it. 5-star, do that. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast on. I'll be there. And follow me on Twitter at Michael Steele. And by the way, get the damn vaccine, wear the mask so we can get past this and we can go to the beach and I can continue to work on my tan. All right. So we got an agenda. That's what we're about. All right. We got an agenda. This is all about Michael still getting to work on his tan. All right. So let's do this. Until next time, y'all, be safe.